Welcome back, everyone. I've been talking about this for a minute, so I wanted to do a video, like a quick video on it. About Utopia versus Dystopia. Now, the really weird thing to me about Utopia and Dystopia is it seems to be that there's a conundrum. We as a society generally tend to accept that utopias are unattainable, unachievable, idealistic, and unrealistic. That generally tends to be a rule of thumb and has not been proven to be anything otherwise yet. But we often also, as a society, as multiple societies as it goes, we tend to think of dystopian societies as actually obtainable and achievable. So then there is this conundrum, and the conundrum is why is it that the negative is attainable, but the positive is unattainable? This doesn't make sense in regards to the natural world. Like when we have nightfall versus daybreak. It's not just things like that either. It's a continuum of balance where it's like, is it that both can exist, neither can exist, or for some reason the negative can exist and the positive can't, and therefore the scale is tilted because of some other kind of foreseen reason, and maybe we are incorrectly labeling these things. So I started thinking about what dystopia really means. Well, we've certainly laid out what we think of as dystopian societies in, works of fiction or countries that have undesirable governments. It was certainly illustrated what dystopian futures or dystopian societies would look like in George Orwell's 1984. It was certainly described in there, or the things like The Matrix. Things like Eon Flux. And then but we've also been able to imagine utopian societies like Star Trek. It's absolutely a utopian type world. This is not free from conflict, though, and the dystopian realities that we've come up with are not absent of freedom either. There's you look at like the Hunger Games. She rises a rebellion against this dystopian world that has been created by some kind of dictator. But I start to wonder if dystopian societies are really achievable at all, just like the positive aspect, utopian societies. Well, why are utopian societies not possible? That goes down to human nature. Our volatile human nature makes it pretty much impossible to create a utopian society. There's always otherizing. There's always some kind of way to say that person's different than me, therefore they are in the wrong and I am in the right. There's probably always going to be sociopathy and psychopathy, personality versus and anti-personality disorders of that nature. There's always that primitive nature just clinging on in the back of our psyches that we can't really seem to rid ourselves of. So there's resources, there's plenty of reasons that we can come up with why utopian societies, and when they've been tried in real life and in practice, they end up in death. They end up not being utopian at all. But would I call them dystopia? I don't know if I would call them that. I don't know if dystopia is entirely possible. Because whenever we see dystopia or something that we would call dystopia, we look at things like fascism or Marxism, communism, that kind of thing. And that's where I get into this concept of society. It would seem that too much freedom results in some sort of chaos, which eventually forms into tribalism, which eventually turns into a society. So we are social animals. Clearly, we need some kind of infrastructure holding us together. What boggles my mind are the people that are absolutely sold on the fact that they need a leader because they can't think for themselves. That boggles my mind. I don't think that's the case here. At looking through societies, looking at the concept of utopia versus dystopia. Now, in the concept of utopia, if indeed when we look at these dictatorships and we say those are dystopians, then we absolutely have to look at developed nations and say that that is utopias. Or at least as close as we're going to get, so we might as well say that that is it. Because we can't do any better than this. This is as good as it gets for the generation or the time frame that we live in. We do not have replicators. We don't have machines that can create resources out of nothing. We don't have that. We do not live in a society where we could perpetuate without some sort of system of commodity and commerce. And even in Star Trek, they still have to engage in barter and trade. Because there's just not there's a limited amount of resources, that living organisms fight over. Certain resources, specific resources. So it could be that the developed worlds are actually utopias, and that the undeveloped worlds, predominantly more authoritarian, totalitarian forms of societies, are actual dystopias that are alive and well, and both the positive and the negative are in existence. Or either that the idea that we cannot obtain a perfect utopian society would suggest that maybe, possibly, these dictatorships do not go all the way, just the same as the developed nations don't go all the way to the completion of a utopian society. Maybe it is impossible for these dictatorships, these totalitarian governments, to make it all the way to what we would consider and describe as a dystopian society. Take, for instance, any time things like a dictator, and by the way, I want to say this, that in light of making this video, ironically, the Burgerkrieg produced a video. Here's a screenshot of that video right here. It's called "The Frog Jumps Out, Though Is the Thing in It?" And I will leave a link to that video because he kind of touches on this subject just a little bit. And I want to expand or elaborate on this conversation, on this philosophical conundrum, because I can't figure it out. Why is it that the positive cannot exist, but the negative can exist? Well, now I'm contemplating that either both do exist, we just can't recognize it, or either that neither one can exist. And that's what I'm saying right now, is that the utopian societies, this is where it gets interesting, is that, have you ever noticed that through dictatorship, totalitarian government, authoritarianism, they seem to get really close to dystopian societies, and they might even touch it. But the one thing is that what we see across the board is that in societies where they take this step, people become rebellious, and they start rejecting this very, very oppressive, controlling regime and wanting more freedom. We're seeing this right now in China. This is literally happening right now in China. The date, year that I am recording this video, and even as it will be uploaded, there are people that are starting to wave American flags in China because they are starting to resist the totalitarian communist government that has been reigning over them and wanting more freedoms. We saw it in communist Russia. We saw people trying to break out of communism. We saw it in fascism, Hitler's fascism and Mussolini's fascism, people trying to break out of these extremely authoritarian governments. In fact, the whole reason the United States even exists was a group of people who wanted to break away from the British royal monarchy, which is another form of dictatorship. People have fought and rebelled against theocracies. And you can even take it down to a micro level rather than a macro level, and say that, you know, things like the 1950s conformity ushered in an era of rebellion, creating the 1960s hippie movement. That things became so restrictive and so conservative that people were rebelling deliberately to break out of that shell. So maybe it is possible that when things become too totalitarian, too controlling, I think it's safe to say that people rebel against it. And they say, no, this is too much authority, it's too much control, we want freedom. And so then I started asking myself, what is it that people generally want? Us being a social animal, a pack animal, we desire a system of hierarchy. So what is it that we look for in this system of hierarchy? Well, it would appear that the big things that we usually tend to look for in a system of hierarchy is that the thing, the entity that is in control, we look to see that they uphold justice, they uphold due process, and they obtain some sort of law and order. But then it would seem that if they start going beyond that and start obtaining more power and authority and control and start leaning more towards authoritarianism or a dictatorship, that's where you see people start to rebel. And they start saying, no, 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 we want freedoms, give me liberty or give me death, sort of thing. And you start having many contrarians to the society or to the form of government itself. You could even use France as an example. They rose up and cut off his head and ended up making one of the first documents ever to document very, very fundamental, basic human rights, such as drinking water, and toiletry. And that document was used in many documents that outline what freedom is. So that makes me wonder if dystopian societies are impossible due to human nature, just the same as utopias are impossible due to human nature. Is that human beings don't seem to want to be controlled. They want a system that upholds justice, due process, law, and order. However, if the society deteriorates to the point of lawlessness, they start complaining that the authoritarian leader isn't doing enough to uphold law, order, due process, and justice. And that seems to be, I think that's the human condition. And I've been talking a lot with the Indo-European Goth about this, and he has some very, very intriguing thoughts on it. And he is very, very baffled, I believe. I could be misspeaking. I don't want to speak for him. But I believe he is very he sees this as much of a conundrum as I do. He doesn't understand why it is the positive can exist or that can't exist, but the negative can. This makes no sense in the natural world. Well, either both can exist and do exist, but we don't label them correctly. We fail to recognize what they are because of our own biases as human beings towards our own society that we create, and our sort of primitive drive to build and associate ourselves with one. So it's quite possible that a dystopian society isn't possible, and nor is a perfect utopian. As the Indo-European Goth told me, he said, how did he put it? One man's anarchy is another man's utopian world. So one person's utopia might be another person's dystopia, and one person's dystopia might be another person's utopia. Meaning that it's entirely subjective upon the individual on how they perceive what a utopia or a dystopia is. And if it's subjective, then these things cannot be defined, at least not on a definitive level. You can't define subjectivity on a definitive level. It's just not possible. You can't do it. It can't be done. You can find a group of people that might agree that your ideal society is utopian or dystopian, whatever the case may be. You can find a group of people that are like-minded in that sense, but you can find like a third group of people that have a completely different idea of what utopia and dystopia is. So you've got a break in ideological principles. And that's where, it goes back to maybe they are both possible, given that the subjective nature of human beings and formulating opinions and how we perceive dystopias and utopias being subjective, and they could change from person to person, that the developed nations are as close to utopia, if not utopias themselves, as human beings in this time frame can possibly get. And that the authoritarian dictatorship totalitarian regimes, such as communism and fascism, and theocracies that still exist in the Middle East, are in fact dystopian societies. Or either that, neither one can exist. Because once you obtain utopia, due to human nature, it is wrecked. Or once you obtain dystopia, due to human nature, it is wrecked. So I find this to be rather intriguing and a rather big conundrum. And I don't know what the answer is, but it certainly would be very odd if the positive cannot exist, but the negation can exist. And that would therefore make you ask more questions as to why is it that the positive cannot exist, but the negation can exist? What underlying fact are we not looking at that differentiates them so that they're not on the same par level? That they can be looked at differently, that they are not in the same kind of ideological sphere, because unfortunately they are, and when there is a positive, there is usually a negative, and this is indicative with the natural world. And maybe this is something I need to take the natural world out of and think more abstract, but I'm not a big fan of that, because that means that we're thinking dogmatically. We're not thinking linearly. We're not thinking about facts, evidence, that kind of thing. So, just about everything that there is, where there's a positive, there's a negative. Where there's a negative, there's a positive. And just about everything. I can't really think of what a system, anything in nature that does not apply to. Like, even for instance, like, when you watch nature videos and you see, you see a cute little bunny rabbit. Oh, we love the bunny rabbit. It's cute. It's adorable. It's harmless. It does nothing but eat vegetables and poop and reproduce. And then, predator comes along and kills it. Oh my God, no, the poor rabbit. Well, what about the babies that it's using the rabbit to feed back at home, because it has to feed the babies. It has to do it. So that's the morality in there is weird at best, because it's like who is more deserving to live? Well, and that's where I think human beings are kind of fucked up, is because we don't really see that balance all the time in human. Don't get me wrong, you don't see it all the time in animals either. But I think even more so with human beings, due to our frontal lobes and cerebral cortex, is we make things up to be mad at each other about. They are purely in our head. Purely and solely in our head. They do not actually exist other than a mere thought, a mere idea of what could be, or what shouldn't be, or whatever the case is. But it boils down to that line of, well, the rabbit deserves to live, but so does the predator. Well, the prey deserves to live, the predator deserves to live. And that's where you kind of get into that weird balance where it's like some of the prey does live, some of them don't. Some of the predators live, some of them don't. And it kind of balances out. So you have this negative and positive type effect. We see it in numbers, clearly. Negative, missing. So the negation can exist, but the positive can't. Well, I'm not buying it. I think either both can exist or neither can exist. And I have explained to you a theorem of how both can exist, and I have also explained to you a theorem of how both can't. So, and I've also kind of illustrated how societies, like if we were zoologists or biologists and we were to just take a step back and observe human behavior and how we develop societies and cultures and all that sort of stuff from an objective standpoint, from an outsider's point of view, how would that look? And I think that's something that I think people need to do more often, is look on the outside. Look how self-absorbed most people are, how they it's almost like they think that the world revolves around them, like they couldn't possibly understand. They're mad in the moment about how long they had to wait to get an item, let's say at a customer service checkout, and they're irritated and they want to take 20 minutes to explain to the person behind the counter how irritated they are, not realizing that now everyone else that's behind them has now waited 20 minutes as well, or a really long time, just as much. So this person can proclaim to them that they are mad that they had to wait for so long. And it's like, well, how self-entitled you are to think that you are the only one who had to spend this amount of time waiting in line just so you could complain about how long you had to wait in line, making everyone else have to wait in line just as long. That's not really looking at the bigger picture, and you see this quite a lot. I see it. I don't know why I'm going into this. So I'm going into explaining like human behavior that I find odd, and I don't know why. That's an odd behavior itself. But anyway, like, so the societal structures that we made, it does appear to be that if society becomes too relaxed and allows for lawlessness, we desire for structure. We go, no, this is too crazy. There's too many things that are going wild. We're burning witches again. We're hanging people. We're chopping their heads off. There's raping. There's pillaging. There's murders. There's factions of things springing up that are going at war with each other over bullshit religions that they've created somehow because they've been isolated for years. We need a unified system to bring an end to this. However, if you approach too much into authoritarianism, people rebel and they say, no, you're telling me what to think, how to dress, how to eat, how to sleep, how to cook, how to clean, who I can and cannot fuck. And I think the philosophy of when it comes to that is allowing for maximum freedom and then only restricting freedoms based on causality and negative consequence. And that is a measurable thing that can be discussed and debated in and of itself. Is utopia and dystopia totally subjective? And even if it is, still, why is it the positive cannot exist, but the negation can? So, and if you want a little bit of if you want a little bit of insight further into this kind of idea, go and check out Burgerkrieg's video. I am not trying to his channel does much better than mine. I'm just saying that like as a talking point, as a reference, as a like maybe a way of swaying you a little bit in one direction or the other. But this is a really baffling issue. Really baffling, really troubling. If you're into philosophy at all, it's a very, very interesting conundrum. So, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. Leave them in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe. Hit the bell button on any channel you're subscribed to. And with that, I'm out.